Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week, we present a special presentation, the audio of a recent event PRI held in Pasadena featuring Jason Riley, the longtime member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board and distinguished author. Jason Riley has been a voice for many years in journalism, offering his unique analysis on policy, economics, and social issues, and he talks about his latest book, The Affirmative Action Myth, Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. And his comments are particularly insightful at a time when those in the California legislature are not listening to the voice of the voters who twice rejected gender and racial preferences, and they're trying again this year to try to reverse, at least in part, California's nearly 3-decade-old ban on affirmative action in California. So sit back after the message, enjoy Jason Riley sharing his thoughts on the debate over affirmative action in California and across the country. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates, so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Thank you for that introduction, Lance. Lance is one of those people whose research allows journalists like me to sound and write things that make us seem smarter than we really are. I spent a lot of my career writing editorials for the Wall Street Journal, and one of my specialties was writing about education reform. So even though Lance and I didn't really meet ever in person until a few years ago, we'd spoken by phone, or I've been reading his research for many, many years here at PRI, and so thank you for that introduction. And I also want to thank PRI for the invitation to speak. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, which isn't a lot of fun these days. So thank you for the change of venue. It's also an excellent time of the year to get out of New York, so I'm doubly grateful. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about affirmative action and how the debate over its efficacy relates to larger discussion the country's been having about social justice. In 2023, the Supreme Court banned racial preferences in college admissions. The court said the policy has violated not only the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which means they were not only illegal, but also unconstitutional. I think the court made the right call, but I also think that racial preferences do more than simply violate the Constitution, which is one of the reasons I decided to write the book. Racial preferences are not simply unjust. They also haven't worked as intended. And in many cases, they've been counterproductive. The intended beneficiaries, low-income blacks, have retrogressed in many areas under these policies. And that's what I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about. Just a quick show of hands. Has anyone here seen the movie Hidden Figures? Oh, okay, very good. So it was released back in 2016, so about a decade ago. And for those who haven't seen it, Hidden Figures tells the true story of 3 remarkable black mathematicians who helped NASA launch its space exploration program in the 1950s and 60s. Their names were Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Katherine Johnson. Vaughn taught computer programming and eventually became NASA's first black supervisor. Jackson became NASA's first black female engineer. And Johnson calculated the rocket trajectories for NASA's first human space flights in the early 1960s, as well as the trajectories that helped land Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969. Now, the film's primary focus is the everyday lives of these women while working at NASA and how they coped with the ugly, racist, and sexist attitudes of the Jim Crow era. But Hidden Figures is more than a story about unsung black math whizzes. It doubles as a story about black upward mobility in the post-World War II period. Progress that was taking place notwithstanding all manner of laws and policies and customs that openly discriminated against blacks. The movie is based on a book of the same title by Margot Shetterly, the daughter of a retired black NASA scientist. And Shetterly's book goes much deeper than the film does. In describing the working class and middle class black communities that produced these remarkable women. Dorothy Vaughan was born in 1910. She attended Wilberforce University, which is the oldest private black college in the U.S., where she majored in math and graduated in 1929. At Wilberforce, a professor recommended her for graduate study in mathematics at Howard University, another black college, where the department was run by two black mathematicians who had earned their doctorates from Cornell and the University of Pennsylvania. Mary Jackson was a second-generation college graduate who earned degrees in math and physical science in 1943 from another black college, Hampton University. Shetterly writes that Hampton's philosophy of black advancement through self-help, quote, mirrored the aspirations and philosophy of the surrounding black community, unquote. Now, these thumbnail sketches of black America in the early and middle decades of the 20th century may surprise people today who have come to associate black communities with crime and violence and underperforming schools and single parenting and high levels of unemployment. The book is a reminder that things used to be much, much different. When Dorothy Vaughan first arrived in segregated Newport News, Virginia, in 1943 to start her job at NASA, she lived with an elderly black couple in the city's East End neighborhood who owned a grocery store. Shetterly writes that the East End was, quote, a larger version of what Dorothy had left behind in rural Virginia. It was, quote, populated by stable Negro families in well-maintained homes, thriving local businesses, and a growing middle class, unquote. On the corner of the block where Vaughan lived, a pharmacist had purchased a lot and was opening the city's first black pharmacy. A new hospital had just opened earlier in the year, organized by black doctors and constructed by black architects. Again, this is 1943. The point here is not to romanticize the Jim Crow era or downplay the importance of civil rights bills that were later passed to end it. The point is to illustrate the importance, what blacks were capable of accomplishing and did in fact accomplish despite Jim Crow and without racial preference policies, which did not begin until the 1960s. This story of what was happening in America among black people who were only a couple generations removed from slavery, still living under legally enforced segregation, has received nowhere near the amount of attention that it deserves. It defies people's expectations. It challenges a lot of what we think we know about black history. It also seriously undermines claims that black people need affirmative action to get ahead in the U.S. One of the things that struck me in the run-up to the Supreme Court decision in 2023, what led me to write my book, was all the apocalyptic talk of what would happen in the absence of these policies. Politicians, academics, cable news commentators all insisted that if affirmative action went away, black people would be devastated. They said there would be no more black upward mobility. They said affirmative action had created the black middle class, and that without it, college campuses would be whitewashed. And I said to myself, wait a minute. That's not what the data show. That's not what the historical record shows. That's not what the experiences of Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson and Katherine Johnson tell us. There was a significant black middle class before affirmative action, and it was growing at a far more rapid pace than it grew in the era of affirmative action. Between 1940 and 1960, for example, the black poverty rate fell from 87% to 47%. That's not only before affirmative action began in the 1960s, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's before not only a black president, but also before blacks had any significant political clout, before black mayors ran big cities with large black populations, before there were majority black city councils and black school superintendents and black police chiefs. During the 1970s, the first full decade of affirmative action, the black poverty rate continued to fall, but at nowhere near the rate that it had been falling in previous decades. Affirmative action has been given credit for a trend that predates its existence. The reality is that black people lifted themselves out of poverty. It was not due to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs or to affirmative action, both of which came later. And the poverty rates are hardly the only evidence of this. During the first 2/3 of the 20th century, well before affirmative action and an expanded welfare state supposedly came to the rescue of blacks, blacks experienced significant progress that was never close to being replicated in the affirmative action era. Education gaps narrowed, incomes rose, so did black home ownership rates. And they just didn't rise in absolute terms. They rose relative to whites, which means the black-white gaps were narrowing. Blacks were catching up. In the 1940s and 50s, the percentage of blacks who earned high school degrees more than tripled, growing at a much faster rate than it did among whites. And more blacks were both entering and completing college during this period. But as colleges began compromising their admission standards in the late 1960s to admit greater numbers of black students, these trends slowed. According to Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam, education gaps that had been narrowing started to widen. Now fewer blacks were completing college relative to their white peers. According to Putnam, the fastest and most dramatic progress toward parity between blacks and whites finishing high school was achieved before 1970. But after 1970, the relative rate at which blacks were completing college dropped, then flatlined, and never recovered its previous upward trajectory. In fact, today, after more than 50 years of racial preferences in higher education, blacks are completing college at a lower rate compared to whites than they were in 1970. A similar story can be told about black incomes. More education meant better jobs and higher pay. And just as educational gains among blacks had been faster than among whites in the decades prior to racial preferences in college admissions, wages for black workers were also rising at a faster rate than they were among whites. In other words, racial gaps in education and income were shrinking in the decades before racial preferences in hiring and college admissions. If anything, racial preferences have done more to throttle black upward mobility. The black-white disparity in family income in 2018 was approximately where it was in 1968. Again, after 50 years of affirmative action policies. It's also worth noting that by the time the Supreme Court issued its ruling in 2023, a number of states, Texas, Florida, Michigan, California, of course, had already banned the practice. What happened? In Texas, after race preferences were banned and replaced with race-neutral policies, black enrollment at the University of Texas rose. The same thing happened at the University of Florida. Here in California, as many of you are aware, racial preferences in college admissions were banned way back in 1996 through a ballot initiative. What happened? Well, at the most elite campuses in the University of California system, Berkeley, UCLA, black admissions initially fell. But throughout the UC system, black admissions rose, and so did graduation rates. In other words, affirmative action, a policy intended to increase the ranks of the black middle class, had in practice resulted in fewer black doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. Why is that? Well, one of the problems with affirmative action is that it mismatches students and schools in order to meet diversity goals. Smart kids are funneled into selective colleges where their academic preparation doesn't match the preparation of other kids at the same school. Numerous studies have shown that one of the most important factors in whether a student succeeds is whether his or her qualifications match those of other students at the same institution. When students are admitted to schools where their qualifications significantly lag the school average, they're far more likely to struggle, to drop out, switch to easier majors, and so forth. After California ended racial preferences, black and Hispanic students were more likely to attend schools where they met the credentials of other students. Consequently, black graduation rates and GPAs increased significantly throughout the UC system, including in the more difficult majors of math, science, and engineering. Under affirmative action, white and Asian kids were more likely to attend schools where they were prepared to handle the work, but black kids were attending schools where they were underprepared. Many more of them were struggling as a result. A Duke University economist published an academic paper on how racial preferences affect the number of black science and economics majors at elite universities. He discovered that among incoming freshmen at Duke who reported a major, more than 76% of black males intended to major in economics or one of the hard sciences, a higher percentage than among white males. Yet only 35% of black males went on to obtain a degree in one of these majors, a 40-point drop-off. The drop-off among their white peers is about 5 points. The racial gap in attrition rates, according to the study, could be entirely accounted for by looking at entry-level SAT scores. Like all elite schools, some black students at Duke are admitted with credentials that match the average student at Duke. And some black students at Duke are admitted with credentials that don't. Those black students accepted to Duke with test scores similar to the average student were no more likely to switch out of the more challenging majors. But again, Duke also admits students with academic credentials far below the average freshman. And it was this latter group that drove the racial gap in attrition rates. Other studies have exposed the same phenomenon. When black students get admitted with lower qualifications than other students, they tend to do less well academically. It's not a question of ability. It's not a question of being qualified. It's a question of being matched properly with the school where the pace of teaching fits that student's level of academic preparation. A study of black students at MIT found that the black students had SAT math scores in the top 10% of all students of all races nationwide. You're talking about some pretty bright black kids. But among their peers at MIT, they were in the bottom 10%. And nearly 25% of them failed to graduate. Students who likely would have thrived at a less selective school wound up struggling, all in the name of diversity. We hear a lot about how racial preferences in college admissions harm whites and Asians, foster racial resentment and campus unrest. It's less well understood how they harm their intended beneficiaries as well. It's also important to know that the mismatch problem isn't limited to race, even though it's usually discussed in that context. Anytime a school significantly lowers its standards for any group, athletes, children of donors, children of alumni, etc., that group is more likely to struggle academically. If Harvard decided to admit left-handed redheads with SAT scores 300 points below those of the average student at Harvard, you would see left-handed redheads struggling academically, pooling at the bottom of the class, switching to easier majors, dropping out at higher rates, and so forth. It's sometimes argued that racial preferences allow underprivileged minorities to attend better institutions. where they'll get a better education. So it all works out at the end. That's a dubious assumption. One study compared black law school graduates at George Mason University with those at Howard University. The study looked at which students passed the bar exam on the first try. George Mason University is a more selective school than Howard University Law School. George Mason University also uses affirmative action to admit black students. Howard University does not. So the study was comparing these two schools. And even though George Mason is a more selective law school than Howard and used racial preferences to admit students, less than a third of their black law students passed the bar on the first try. At Howard, it was around 60%. So ask yourself, did those black students who were admitted to the more selective school under affirmative action really receive a better education? Rarely, however, is any of this discussed when considering the merits of affirmative action policies. And that's because affirmative action is part of a larger push towards social justice, where intentions matter more than results. But social justice advocates have to ask themselves, are they seeking justice? Or are they seeking payback and revenge? Because social justice and traditional justice are two very different concepts. And social justice advocates have attempted to redefine what is commonly understood when we talk about what is just and what is fair. Traditional justice is about ensuring an impartial process. It's not about guaranteeing certain results. A defendant in a criminal trial has received justice. The trial is conducted under fair rules with an impartial judge and jury, regardless of whether the verdict is guilty or not guilty. A baseball game is considered fair if everyone plays by the same rules, regardless of who wins. Social justice is closer to the opposite of this. Rules and standards can be set aside in hopes of achieving certain results. And the larger ramifications for society, that is the trade-offs, are downplayed or even ignored. Think about a university admissions process that has one set of criteria for black applicants and a different set for whites. What matters most to the social justice advocate is the outcome, not the process. In fact, to the social justice advocate, the process should be rigged, if necessary, to get a desired result, such as more racial balance on campus, even if that means discriminating against certain groups to get that outcome. But if racial discrimination is wrong, it's wrong. And its wrongness doesn't depend on who's on the receiving end. I can't complain about discrimination when it's directed at blacks and then look the other way when it's directed at other groups. If I do, then I have no moral standing. I'm not seeking justice. I'm seeking payback. I'm seeking revenge. Racial preferences are very popular with elites, which is why you saw so many liberal politicians and academics, media figures, bemoaning the court decision back in 2023. But it's worth noting that most Americans, around 70%, including a majority of whites, a majority of blacks, a majority of Asians, a majority of Hispanics, all supported the ruling. Colorblindness has become a dirty word on the political left these days, but most Americans support colorblind policies. And history shows that black people have made greater strides under policies of colorblindness than under affirmative action. I'll close with this. Nothing I've said here this evening should be interpreted as an attempt to romanticize the Jim Crow era, or to pretend that racism is somehow behind us. Jim Crow was a horrific period for blacks and an embarrassment to a country with our professed ideals. The point is not to suggest that blacks were advancing because of segregation. The point is that they were advancing notwithstanding it. Nor am I arguing that racism in America is somehow behind us, or that it has played no role in hampering black upward mobility. The challenge is figuring out how much of a role it plays in the 21st century, and the racial disparities we see today, and how much of a role other non-racial factors play. Blacks of a previous era had to deal with much more adversity in society, Yet by many measures, they still had much better outcomes in poverty reduction, home ownership rates, wage gains, educational attainment, and so forth. And all of it happened in the absence of racial preferences for blacks. In fact, a lot of it took place when there were racial preferences for whites. I believe that there are many problems with affirmative action besides its legality. It undermines black achievement, reinforces negative stereotypes, it leads to more tribalism and racial resentment in a multi-ethnic society like ours, and it makes black people, who largely lifted themselves out of poverty, look like people who owe their advancement to government programs and preferential treatment. To anyone who knows Black American history, that's not only incorrect, it's insulting. I'll stop there. Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.